Some betrayals don't come with screaming. They arrive quietly, right through your own front door. The afternoon Daniel walked in with Sophia, he didn't even look at me. He guided her straight to his mother, Margaret, and said calmly, "This is Sophia. She will be taking Hannah's place." Margaret, the woman who never thought I was good enough, gave a warm, welcoming smile. "You have no value here anymore," she told me. "No arguments, no tears." They expected me to break, but they didn't know I was already memorizing every single detail. Looking back, I realize my marriage didn't end the day she walked into my house. It ended 5 years ago, the day I agreed to move into his family's home. Daniel said it was temporary, just a way to save money for our future. I believed him. I actually believed him. I handed in my resignation. We packed up my small apartment and walked right into Margaret's cage. Margaret, my mother-in-law, didn't just rule the house. She owned us. From day one, I wasn't a wife. I was an acquisition, a free live-in servant who came attached to her precious son. I gave up my career because Daniel convinced me it made perfect financial sense. That was my first mistake. My fatal mistake. When you give up your independence for love, you aren't building a future. You're handing over your only weapons. The control didn't start with shouting. It started with a smile and a suggestion. Margaret told Daniel it was safer to merge all our savings into the family trust. Before I knew it, my bank cards were canceled. My own hard-earned money, gone. If I wanted to buy groceries or a coffee or even a pair of cheap socks, or I had to submit a request through a family budgeting app. An app. I was a 30-year-old woman begging for $10. Every single purchase was scrutinized, mocked, and usually denied. "You don't need this, Hannah," Margaret would say, staring at my phone screen with that cold smirk. "We are saving for Daniel's future. Daniel's future. Never ours." If I bought the wrong brand of milk, the receipts were laid out on the dinner table like crime scene photos. The humiliation was a daily ritual, a slow drip of poison designed to completely break my spirit. And then came the dinner parties. Margaret loved hosting her wealthy country club friends, showing off her pristine, massive house. But I wasn't a hostess. I was the help. While they sat in the living room drinking expensive wine, I was trapped in the kitchen, chopping, roasting, and scrubbing until my hands bled. I wore a nice dress, but over it, a stained apron that felt exactly like a prison uniform. When I carried the heavy trays out, nobody looked at my face. I was just the hands pouring the soup, the silent shadow clearing the dirty plates. Once, a guest complimented the roast, and Margaret smiled, taking full credit. "Oh, I have my secrets," she purred. Daniel just sat there, chewing, never once looking up to say, "My wife cooked this." I was invisible, completely erased from my own life. I remember the winter I caught a severe flu. My fever spiked to 103. My bones ached. My throat felt like shattered glass, and I could barely stand. I curled up in bed, shivering, hoping for just one day of rest. But Margaret's sharp footsteps echoed down the hall. She pushed the door open without even knocking. "And the guests are arriving at 6, Hannah," she snapped, staring down at my pale, sweating face. "Get up. A little cold is no excuse to ruin my evening." I looked at Daniel, begging him with my eyes to defend me, to say, "Mom, she's sick." But he just adjusted his expensive tie in the mirror and whispered, "Just power through it, okay? Don't make a scene." I dragged my burning body out of bed. I stood over that blazing stove for 4 hours, dizzy, on the verge of collapsing. All while they laughed and clinked glasses in the next room. That night, leaning against the cold kitchen tiles, I realized I could drop dead in this house, and Margaret would only complain about the mess on her floor. People always ask the exact same question. If it was so bad, why did you stay? Why didn't you just leave? They don't understand. They just don't get it. You don't wake up one morning and decide to be a helpless victim. It happens slowly. It's the boiled frog effect. First they take your money, then they take your voice, Then they convince you that you are absolutely nothing without them. Margaret isolated me so completely that I believed I had nowhere to go. I had no savings, no job history for 5 years, no confidence left. Every time I tried to speak up, they gaslit me. They called me crazy, ungrateful, overly dramatic. When you hear that every single day, you start to believe it. You start to think, maybe I am the problem. Maybe this is just what marriage is supposed to be. You stay because your reality has been so warped, you can't even see the exit door anymore. A marriage doesn't die from one massive, dramatic explosion of betrayal. It dies from 1,000 tiny cuts, hundreds of invisible moments of disrespect, of being ignored, of being told you do not matter. 5 years wasn't a marriage. It was an erasure, a slow, systematic deletion of Hannah, until there was nothing left but a ghost haunting her own life. It started with the silence. At first, I told myself he was just exhausted. Daniel had always been ambitious, but suddenly the office demanded every waking hour of his life. He started coming home long after midnight. The sound of his key turning in the lock used to be the only thing I looked forward to, but soon it became a trigger for a deep, twisting anxiety in the pit of my stomach. When he did come home, he was cold. He avoided my eyes completely. If I tried to touch his shoulder, he would flinch, just a tiny, subtle pull away. But to a wife who loves her husband, that tiny movement feels exactly like a slap across the face. He built a massive, invisible wall around himself, and I was left standing on the outside, freezing. Then came the signs I tried so desperately to ignore. I was doing his laundry one Sunday morning, and there it was. A scent that absolutely did not belong in our house. It was sweet, heavy, and expensive. It lingered on his collars like a ghost mocking my existence. I held the fabric in my hands, my heart hammering violently against my ribs, but I just tossed it into the machine and let the water wash the evidence away. Then, the phone calls started. He would be sitting on the couch, his phone would vibrate, and he would snatch it up like the glass was burning his skin. "I have to take this outside," he would mutter, or stepping out into the freezing night just to hide a whispered conversation from me. I wasn't stupid. I knew exactly what was happening, but I consciously chose to swallow the bitter taste of reality. People always wonder why a betrayed woman doesn't just confront her husband the second she smells another woman's perfume. They look from the outside and think it is just pathetic weakness, but they don't understand the paralyzing, suffocating grip of total dependence. In psychology, there is a term for it: learned helplessness. When you are constantly controlled, constantly diminished, constantly told you are absolutely nothing without the people holding your leash, your brain actually stops looking for an escape. You become like a rabbit cornered by wolves, convinced that if you just stay perfectly still, maybe, just maybe, they won't tear you apart. Margaret had already stripped away my money, my career, and my self-worth. Daniel was the only fragile thread tying me to a normal life. If I cut that thread by speaking up, I would be in free fall. I convinced myself that as long as I didn't say the words out loud, the nightmare wasn't real. I played the role of the blind, devoted wife perfectly. I kept the house spotless. I cooked his favorite meals, even when he never showed up to eat them. I smiled through Margaret's daily insults because I foolishly thought my absolute obedience would somehow buy my husband back. It is a terrifying realization. When you are completely financially and emotionally dependent on someone, the truth becomes a weapon far more dangerous than the lie. The lie hurts, but it lets you keep a roof over your head. The truth destroys everything you have left. I was so terrified of losing the pathetic scraps of a life I had that I chose to live completely in the dark. But the dark is a dangerous place to hide. You can close your eyes, you can cover your ears, but you cannot stop the storm from hitting your house. The late nights turned into weekend business trips. The coldness turned into open, vicious irritation. Every single time he looked at me, I saw pure disgust in his eyes. He wasn't just hiding a dirty secret anymore. He was resenting me for simply existing in his space. He was treating me like an inconvenient piece of trash, waiting to be taken out. I thought my silence would protect me, but it only gave them the confidence to bring the destruction right to my front door. It was a Tuesday afternoon, and I came home early from picking up Margaret's dry cleaning, my hands full of her expensive silk dresses. I opened the front door, and the first thing I noticed wasn't Daniel. It was a pair of designer heels near the entrance. Red bottoms, expensive, carelessly kicked off. My heart stopped. My blood turned to absolute ice. I dropped the bags and walked slowly into the living room, and there she was, Sophia. She was sitting on my sofa, holding my favorite coffee mug, laughing. Daniel was right next to her, his hand resting intimately on her bare knee. He looked up when I entered. He didn't jump. He didn't pull away. He just stared at me with completely dead, empty eyes. There was no guilt in his expression. There was no panic, just pure annoyance, like a landlord looking at a tenant who had stayed far past her welcome. "Sit down." "Hannah," he commanded, his voice as casual as if he were ordering a cheap lunch. I couldn't move. My throat was so tight I couldn't even force out a single breath. Sophia smirked, took a slow sip from my mug, and leaned back against the cushions. Daniel reached into his leather briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of papers. He slammed them onto the glass coffee table. The sound echoed in the silent room like a gunshot. "I want a divorce," he stated flatly. "I've already had my lawyers draft the settlement. Sign it now, and we can make this quick and painless for everyone." I looked down at the documents. My hands were shaking so violently I could barely turn the crisp white pages. It wasn't a settlement. It was a total robbery. No alimony. No claim to the house. No access to the joint savings I had poured my entire life into. He was offering me a laughable $5,000. $5,000 for 5 years of my blood, my sweat, my absolute submission. "You are leaving me with nothing," I finally whispered, my voice cracking under the crushing weight of reality. "You brought nothing into this marriage," Daniel replied, his tone dripping with absolute contempt. "Why should you leave with anything? You should be on your knees thanking me that I'm even giving you enough to rent a cheap apartment back in your pathetic little hometown." The sheer cruelty of his words felt like a jagged knife twisting directly into my chest. This was the man I had given up my career for, the man I had served like a devoted slave, day and night. Before I could even process the breathtaking scale of his betrayal, I heard sharp footsteps behind me. Margaret walked into the room, her posture stiff, her face set in a victorious, cruel sneer. She didn't look at Daniel. She didn't acknowledge Sophia. She walked straight up to me and looked me dead in the eyes. "Do not make a pathetic scene, Hannah," she hissed, her voice cutting through the air like a whip. "You always were overly dramatic and utterly useless. Did you honestly think you belonged here? You are a temporary convenience that has simply outlived its usefulness. Take the miserable money and get out of my house. You were never a part of this family. You were never a part of this family." Her cold words echoed in my head over and over again, and standing there, looking at the three of them, the united front of my total destruction, the thick fog in my brain finally cleared. I understood everything: the canceled bank cards, the isolation, the constant humiliation. It wasn't just them being cruel. It was a calculated, deliberate strategy. They had been intentionally draining me of my resources, stripping me of my power, preparing for this exact moment. People always think betrayal happens in a single chaotic flash of passion. They are entirely wrong. You don't get betrayed in one day. You just finally realize it in one day. The betrayal had been happening for 5 agonizing years. But as I looked at Daniel's arrogant, smug face, something inside me finally snapped. The crying, desperate wife died in that living room, and someone entirely different woke up. I didn't sign their pathetic papers. I didn't scream, and I didn't drop to my knees to beg for my own life. I just turned my back on their smug faces and walked straight out the front door. And the heavy oak door clicked shut behind me, and for the first time in 5 long years, the world was completely silent. I stood there on the driveway, staring at the perfectly manicured lawn. I expected to fall apart. I expected to collapse right there on the cold concrete and cry until I couldn't pull air into my lungs. But the tears never came. My eyes were completely dry. The crushing, suffocating weight that had been pressing down on my chest for half a decade was suddenly gone. I wasn't just walking away from a beautiful suburban house. I was walking away from the terrified, obedient ghost they had successfully turned me into. The freezing wind hit my face, and strangely, it didn't feel like an ending at all. It felt exactly like waking up from a very long, paralyzing nightmare. I started walking down the empty street, my hands shoved deep into my coat pockets. I had absolutely no money, no car, and nowhere to go. But I had something far more dangerous brewing inside me. I finally had absolute crystal clarity. I pulled out my phone. There was only one number I could possibly call, not because I wanted to cry on a shoulder, but because I desperately needed an anchor to my old self. I dialed Victor. Victor and I had worked side by side years ago, back when I was a relentless financial analyst, long before I ever became Daniel's invisible maid. He was the only person left in this entire city who actually remembered who I used to be. The phone rang twice, and then I heard his voice. "Hello, Hannah," he said, his tone completely calm, almost as if he had been waiting for this exact call. I took a deep, steadying breath. "It is over," I told him, and my voice surprisingly firm, completely empty of fear. "I need to see you." People always romanticize the idea of a knight riding in to rescue the broken damsel. But when you have been methodically stripped of your dignity, the absolute last thing you need is another person treating you like a fragile victim. You don't need someone to save you. You need someone to look you in the eye and remind you that you already know exactly how to fight. Victor didn't offer me useless pity, and he didn't ask if I was okay. He just gave me an address and told me to get there safely. That was the exact moment the submissive wife truly died, and my real plan began. I met Victor at a dimly lit diner on the edge of the city. The rain was beating heavily against the glass, but inside, the air was suffocatingly still. Then it had been 5 full years since I last saw him, back when we were ruthlessly climbing the corporate ladder together. He looked exactly the same, sharp, intensely focused, always 10 steps ahead of everyone else in the room. I sat down in the booth, clutching my cold hands together, fully expecting him to ask how I was holding up, fully expecting that pathetic look of pity people give to a discarded wife. But Victor didn't offer any empty sympathy. He didn't even ask about Daniel. He simply reached into his briefcase and slid a heavy, unmarked manila folder across the sticky table. "Open it," he instructed, his voice completely steady and cold. My fingers were still trembling from the nightmare of the morning, but I pulled back the cover. The very first page was an official document, a marriage certificate. I stared at the printed names, my exhausted brain struggling to make sense of the letters. Victor and Sophia. I snapped my head up to look at him, my breath catching roughly in my throat. Sophia, the woman sitting on my sofa just an hour ago, is your wife, I gasped, the words tumbling out in pure disbelief. He didn't blink. He just nodded slowly. "She still is legally tied to me," he replied quietly. That was the exact moment the ground completely opened up and swallowed me whole. I had spent the entire morning believing I was just the sad victim of a cliché, tragic little love triangle. I genuinely thought Daniel had simply grown tired of me and replaced me with a shiny new toy. But the reality staring back at me from that folder was so much darker, so much more calculated. Victor leaned forward. or his dark eyes locking entirely onto mine. "Sophia does not love your husband," he stated, slicing right through the remaining illusions I had. "She doesn't even respect him. She's a professional financial parasite, Hannah. She specifically hunts for arrogant men with massive egos and deep family trusts. She isolates them, flatters them, and then methodically bleeds their accounts completely dry. Daniel isn't her romantic endgame. He is literally just her next tool." I frantically flipped through the rest of the folder. It was a perfectly documented trail of absolute destruction. Pages of secret bank transfers, shell companies, and fake offshore investments. Sophia had quietly funneled away Victor's company assets for years before he finally caught on. Now she was doing the exact same thing to the Reed family. Suddenly, the horrifying puzzle pieces slammed together. Daniel's sudden obsession with moving liquid assets, Margaret constantly bragging about her brilliant new future daughter-in-law's wealthy connections. Sophia wasn't just taking my place in that house. She was taking total control of the Reed family's entire fortune. And the most sickening, deeply ironic part of it all, Daniel and Margaret actually thought they had won. They were so incredibly arrogant, so busy ruthlessly treating me like worthless trash that they didn't even notice the trap closing tightly around their own necks. They thought they were the apex predators, replacing a weak sheep. But they were completely blind to the wolf sitting right on their custom leather sofa. It is a deeply terrifying realization. When you are drowning in betrayal, you focus all your energy on the people directly hurting you. I hated Daniel. I hated Margaret with every fiber of my being. But as I sat there staring at the undeniable proof of their impending collapse, the absolute truth finally hit me. In this world, the people you hate the most are rarely the most dangerous ones in the room. Daniel and Margaret weren't the victorious masterminds. They were just the incredibly stupid, oblivious prey, walking right into the slaughterhouse with greedy smiles on their faces. I looked down at my own empty hands. Just hours ago, I was devastated because I was leaving with nothing. Now, I realized leaving with nothing was the only thing that actually saved me. I stared at the documents scattered across the sticky table, my mind racing 1,000,000 miles a minute. Victor closed the heavy folder and leaned back against the red vinyl booth. He didn't offer me a tissue. He didn't tell me everything was going to be magically okay. He told me exactly what I needed to do to survive. "I need that evidence, Hannah," he said, his voice dropping low, cutting through the background noise of the diner. "And you need your life back, but we cannot just walk into a courtroom right now and point fingers. Sophia is incredibly smart. She hides her financial tracks perfectly behind dummy corporations and encrypted files. If we move too soon, she will vanish, and Daniel will keep every single penny he stole from you." "So what do we do?" I asked, my hands finally stopping their pathetic trembling. He looked at me, a cold, calculating light shining in his dark eyes. "You go back. Go back," I repeated, the very thought making my stomach twist violently. After they just threw me out like absolute garbage. After Margaret told me I was never part of the family. You want me to go back to that house? Exactly. Victor nodded, completely unfazed by my anger. Step 1. You go back tonight. You apologize for your dramatic exit. You literally beg them for a place to stay. You let them think they have completely, utterly broken your spirit. You let Margaret humiliate you all over again. Step 2. You become totally invisible. You become a ghost in that house. While they are busy gloating and planning their grand wedding, you start digging. Every single bank statement, every private email, every hidden ledger in Daniel's home office. You copy absolutely everything. Step 3. Then we wait in total silence for the absolute perfect moment to strike. I sat there in the dimly lit diner, listening to the heavy rain hitting the glass window. Every single instinct in my body was screaming at me to fight back immediately. I wanted to march right back into that massive living room, scream directly into Daniel's arrogant face, and slap that smug, sickening smirk right off Margaret's face. I wanted to break the expensive vases. I wanted to tear that house apart until they felt exactly how much they had hurt me. But people constantly confuse emotional revenge with actual protection. Emotional revenge is screaming in the driveway. It is throwing his expensive suits on the wet lawn. It is crying on the internet for sympathy. It feels incredibly good for about 5 minutes. But when the screaming finally stops, you are still the one standing out in the cold, completely broke and entirely alone. They just call you crazy, lock the doors, and move on with their wealthy lives. True justice isn't about making a loud, chaotic noise. It is about cold, calculated protection of your absolute rights. It is quietly securing the undeniable evidence, legally freezing their stolen assets, and systematically dismantling the financial cage they built around you. If I threw a desperate tantrum now, Daniel would just hide the money faster. But if I swallowed my pride, if I played the exact pathetic role they expected me to play, I could take back every single thing they stole from me. Revenge is not a loud scream. It is a deadly silence. It is smiling warmly at the people who destroyed you, while you quietly sharpen the knife they handed you. I looked at Victor across the table. I thought about the 5 agonizing years of my life that Daniel and Margaret had completely erased. I thought about the hundreds of times I stood in that hot kitchen, swallowing my own bitter tears, genuinely believing I was completely worthless. They wanted a weak, pathetic, obedient servant. Well, they were about to get one. "How much time do we actually have?" I asked, my voice no longer shaking at all. "Margaret's 60th birthday party is in exactly 3 weeks. Victor replied, a dark, satisfied smile finally forming on his lips. "She is inviting the entire country club, all of Daniel's business partners, all of their wealthy, snobby friends. It will be the biggest, most important social event of her pathetic life. 3 weeks, 21 days to play the ultimate fool." The 21 days of brutal, soul-crushing humiliation. "I will do it," I said, sliding the heavy folder back to him. "I will go back to that house tonight. I will get on my knees if I have to. But Victor, when we finally drop this bomb in front of everyone, I want to make absolutely sure there is nothing left of them." "Oh, don't worry, Hannah," he whispered. "When we are done, they won't even have a house to hide in." I walked out of that diner into the freezing, relentless rain. I was still wearing the same cheap, worn-out coat. I still had absolutely no money in my pocket, but I wasn't the scared, broken little wife anymore. I was a weapon. And the countdown had officially begun. I walked back up that massive concrete driveway the very same night. The rain had soaked straight through my cheap coat, but I didn't care. I knocked on the heavy oak door, my hands completely numb from the freezing wind. Daniel answered. His arrogant smirk immediately dropped into a look of utter disgust when he saw me shivering on the porch. "I have nowhere to go?" I whispered, forcing my voice to tremble, forcing the tears to pool in my eyes. "Please, just let me stay until I can figure something out." Margaret appeared behind him, clutching a glass of expensive wine. She looked at me like I was a diseased rat that had crawled out of the gutter. "I knew you wouldn't last a single day out there," she sneered. Daniel didn't want to let me in. But Margaret loved the absolute power trip. She wanted a front row seat to my total destruction. They made me sign a temporary residency agreement. It was a pathetic, degrading piece of paper. When it explicitly stated I had absolutely no rights to the main bedrooms, no rights to eat their expensive food, and no right to speak to their wealthy guests. I signed it without a single moment of hesitation. They pointed me down the dark, narrow hallway to the basement laundry room. That was my new kingdom. A cold, windowless concrete box next to the humming washing machines. They threw an old, stained mattress on the hard floor. There were no blankets, no pillows, just the harsh, flickering, fluorescent light above me. I sat down on that dirty mattress, listening to the heavy footsteps of Daniel and Sophia laughing right above my head. A month ago, hearing them together would have completely shattered my heart. But that night, sitting in the freezing dark, my heart was completely still. I wasn't a broken wife crying in the basement. I was a spy who had just successfully breached enemy lines. The next morning, the real torture began. If I thought I was treated like a servant before, it was absolutely nothing compared to this. I was their personal punching bag. Sophia made a deliberate point of leaving her expensive silk lingerie scattered across the bathroom floor for me to wash. She would sit at my dining table, drinking from my favorite mug, complaining loudly about how incompetent I was. Margaret made me scrub the grout in the kitchen with a tiny toothbrush while her wealthy friends stood there, watching and whispering. "Oh, we are just doing charity for Daniel's tragic mistake," Margaret would announce, making sure I heard every single word. They pushed me. They insulted me. They treated me like absolute garbage. They wanted me to scream. When they wanted me to break down and throw a pathetic, emotional tantrum so they could finally call the police and throw me out legally. But I didn't give them a single drop of satisfaction. I swallowed the bitter humiliation every single day. I kept my head down, my voice completely silent, and my face perfectly blank. Because when the sun went down and the massive house fell dead silent, my real work began. I would wait until exactly 2 a.m. Then I would slip out of the laundry room like a ghost. I crept into Daniel's home office, my hands moving fast in the absolute dark. I copied his hard drives. I photographed his private tax returns. I forwarded Sophia's hidden email threads to Victor's encrypted server. I didn't just steal their secrets. I studied them. Sitting on that cold basement floor using a tiny flashlight, and I read complex financial laws. I analyzed offshore banking loopholes. I was meticulously building a legal guillotine, piece by piece. People always think that true strength is standing up and fighting back the second someone hits you. They think power is screaming louder than your abuser. But they are completely wrong. True strength does not lie in a blind, emotional reaction. It lies in absolute, calculated control. It is the terrifying ability to let your enemy think they are winning, to let them get comfortable, arrogant, and incredibly sloppy. I wasn't just hiding in that basement. I was quietly locking all the doors from the inside. They thought they had trapped a helpless rabbit. They didn't realize they had locked themselves in the cage with a starving wolf. Sitting on that stained mattress in the dead of night, staring at the glowing screen of my phone, I stumbled across an article about domestic control. The words on the screen felt like they were written directly about my own life. Society has conditioned us to believe that abuse only looks one specific way. We are taught to look for the physical signs: a black eye, a split lip, a bruised wrist. If you don't have those visible marks, people tell you that you are just dealing with normal marriage problems. They tell you that all families have drama, and you just need to try harder to be a good wife. But the absolute truth is so much darker than that. The things that do not leave bruises are the exact things that kill you the slowest. Margaret and Daniel never raised a hand to strike me. They didn't have to. They found a much more effective way to completely destroy me. When they used weapons that no one else could legally see, they used my own love and trust against me, turning my blind dedication into a suffocating trap. When Daniel convinced me to give up my career and merge my bank accounts, that wasn't a logical financial decision for our future. It was financial abuse. It was a calculated move to ensure I could never afford a plane ticket home, never hire a lawyer, never even buy a cup of cheap coffee without his explicit permission. When Margaret slowly stopped inviting my few friends to the house, claiming they didn't fit in with her wealthy country club circle, that wasn't just her being a snob, it was deliberate isolation. She was systematically cutting the safety ropes connecting me to the outside world. And when they forced me to scrub floors and serve their guests while they mocked my small-town background, that wasn't just poor manners. It was relentless psychological warfare. This is the terrifying reality of emotional abuse. It doesn't break your bones. It breaks your entire perception of reality. It is a slow, methodical poison that drips into your mind day after day until you actually start to believe that you are the toxic one. When someone calls you useless, crazy, and pathetic every single day for 5 agonizing years, your brain completely stops fighting back. You start to internalize their cruel voices as your own absolute truth. You look in the mirror and you don't see a victim. You see a burden. That is why it is so incredibly dangerous. Physical wounds eventually heal. But psychological abuse fundamentally rewires your brain to make you doubt your own sanity. I spent 5 years thinking I was a terrible, ungrateful wife. I spent thousands of hours crying in absolute silence, desperately trying to figure out how to fix myself so they would finally love me. I thought it was just strict family dynamics. I thought I just needed to be more patient, more obedient, more invisible. But sitting in that freezing laundry room, reading those clinical definitions, the heavy fog in my brain finally evaporated. It wasn't my fault. I was never the problem. I wasn't a bad wife failing at a difficult marriage. I was a hostage trapped in a highly organized system of control. Naming the monster didn't just give me comfort. It gave me my absolute sanity back. They wanted me to believe that my total lack of power was my own personal failure. But it wasn't a failure at all. It was their deliberate design. Once you finally recognize the abuse for what it truly is, you stop blaming yourself. The crippling shame that kept me paralyzed for years completely vanished. It was replaced by a cold, sharp, brilliant anger. I realized that they hadn't just stolen my money and my time. They had stolen my mind. But sitting there in the dark, I violently took my mind back. They thought they had completely broken my spirit, but all they really did was strip away my naive innocence. The woman who cried when her husband yelled was dead, and the woman who replaced her was entirely immune to their poison. The 21 days passed like a long, suffocating shadow. And then, the night of Margaret's 60th birthday finally arrived. The massive house was entirely transformed. Crystal chandeliers were polished until they gleamed like diamonds, and the air was thick with the scent of expensive champagne and roasted meats. Dozens of luxury cars lined our long driveway. Every single important person in Daniel's elite circle was there. The wealthy investors, the judgmental country club wives, the powerful city administrators. It was exactly the grand, arrogant stage Margaret had always dreamed of, and I was placed exactly where she wanted me, at the absolute bottom. I wasn't seated at the main dining table. I wasn't even seated with the distant relatives. Margaret had arranged a small, wobbly folding chair in the darkest corner of the dining room, right next to the swinging kitchen doors. It was a deliberate, highly public statement. She wanted every single guest to walk past me, to see the discarded, pathetic first wife, and to completely pity me. I wore a plain, faded dress, while Sophia floated through the room in a stunning, custom-made silver gown. She looked exactly like a bride, and that was entirely the point. Before the dinner was served, Margaret actually walked over to my corner. She looked down at me, her eyes glittering with absolute malice. "Make sure you clear the plates quickly tonight, Hannah," she whispered, her voice dripping with icy venom. "We wouldn't want Sophia's special night ruined by your usual incompetence." I just nodded slowly, my face perfectly blank. "Of course, Margaret," I replied quietly. "I will make sure tonight is a night no one ever forgets." Soon Daniel stood at the head of the long table, declinking his crystal glass with a silver spoon. The loud chatter immediately died down. He pulled Sophia tightly against his side, his face glowing with absolute arrogant pride. "I want to thank you all for being here tonight to celebrate my wonderful mother." he announced, his voice echoing in the large room. "But tonight is also about new beginnings. I am incredibly proud to introduce the woman who has brought so much light into our family. My beautiful future wife, Sophia." The room erupted into loud applause. Margaret stood up and pulled Sophia into a massive, theatrical hug. "Welcome to our real family, my darling," she declared, loud enough for the entire house to hear. A few of the guests turned their heads to look at me, sitting completely alone in the shadows. They expected to see a shattered, hysterical woman. And they expected me to run out of the room in tears or to stand up and scream like a crazy, jealous ex. Daniel glanced over at me, a cruel, mocking smirk playing on his lips. He was practically begging me to break down. He wanted the absolute validation of my total destruction. But I just sat there. I picked up my cheap glass of water, took a slow sip, and looked right back at him with absolutely empty eyes. My hands were not shaking. My breathing was completely steady. As I watched Sophia smiling and drinking Daniel's expensive wine, I didn't feel a single drop of jealousy. I actually felt a dark, chilling sense of peace. They had spent the last 3 weeks treating me like an invisible ghost, completely unaware that the ghost was holding all their hidden bank records, all their secret emails, and a fully drafted legal trap. There is a deeply unsettling phenomenon in nature. Right before a massive, devastating hurricane hits the coast, the wind completely dies. The birds stop singing, the ocean goes perfectly, terrifyingly flat. It is the absolute calm before total destruction. People in abusive situations are often judged by their immediate reactions. If you scream, they call you crazy. If you cry, they call you weak. But what they don't tell you is that the most dangerous phase of a victim's journey isn't the screaming. It is the silence. When a person who has been tormented for years suddenly stops reacting, when they stop defending themselves, stop arguing, and just silently watch you, it doesn't mean they have finally given up. It means they have finally accepted the reality of what must be done. They are no longer a victim trying to survive. They are an executioner waiting for the clock to strike. And my clock was out of time. The applause was still echoing off the crystal chandeliers when I finally stood up from my wobbly little chair in the dark corner. I didn't rush. I didn't tremble. I just walked slowly, deliberately, right toward the head of the long dining table. The sound of my worn-out shoes clicking against the expensive marble floor seemed to cut straight through the music. The chatter immediately died down into a tense, incredibly uncomfortable silence. The wealthy country club wives stopped whispering and stared at me with wide, completely judgmental eyes. They fully expected the discarded, pathetic first wife to finally have her embarrassing public meltdown. Margaret's face twisted into a mask of pure, absolute fury. "What do you think you are doing?" "Hannah," she hissed, stepping forward as if to physically block me from ruining her perfect stage. "Get back to the laundry room right now before I have security drag you out into the freezing street." Daniel crossed his arms, looking down at me with that same deeply arrogant, mocking smirk he had worn for the past 3 weeks. "Let her speak, Mom," he chuckled, his voice echoing loudly in the completely silent room. "Let's hear what my lovely ex-wife has to say on this beautiful evening. Go ahead, Hannah. Give us your pathetic, desperate little speech. Beg for your miserable pennies in front of all my friends." I looked at Daniel, then at Margaret, and finally at Sophia. Sophia was standing there in her stunning, custom-made silver gown, holding a glass of expensive champagne, completely radiating fake innocence and total victory. And I didn't scream. I didn't throw my drink in her arrogant face. I just smiled, a cold, completely hollow smile. "I don't have a speech, Daniel," I said quietly, my voice perfectly steady and clear. "But I did bring a very special guest to help celebrate your wonderful new beginning." Margaret let out a sharp, insulting laugh that echoed harshly off the walls. "A guest? You don't have any friends left in this entire city, Hannah. Who could you possibly have invited to my house? Right on cue, the heavy oak double doors at the entrance of the dining room slowly swung open. The sound of the massive brass hinges groaning seemed to instantly suck all the remaining air out of the room. Every single head turned. Victor stepped over the threshold. He wasn't wearing a cheap suit. He was dressed flawlessly, exuding an aura of absolute, terrifying authority. He walked into that room like he already owned every single brick of their precious, wealthy estate. Daniel frowned, his arrogant smirk finally faltering into genuine confusion. "Who the hell are you?" he demanded loudly, stepping in front of Sophia to protect his shiny new prize. Margaret glared at the stranger, completely offended that someone she hadn't personally vetted dared to interrupt her flawless night. But I wasn't looking at Daniel or Margaret. I was watching Sophia. The transformation was absolutely breathtaking, the smug, victorious glow completely drained from her flawless face in less than a second. Her skin turned the color of dead ash. The expensive champagne flute slipped right through her trembling fingers and shattered violently against the marble floor, and the sharp crack echoed through the dead silent room like a gunshot. She couldn't breathe. She just stared at Victor, completely paralyzed by pure, unadulterated terror. Victor didn't look at Daniel. He didn't even acknowledge Margaret's loud, angry demands. He walked straight past the confused, wealthy guests, right up to the head of the table. He stopped just a few feet away from Sophia, looking down at her with a gaze so incredibly cold it could instantly freeze blood. "Hello, darling," Victor said, his voice terrifyingly calm. "You look absolutely beautiful tonight, but you forgot to sign our divorce papers before you started planning your next big wedding." The entire room gasped in total, shocked unison. The silence that followed was so heavy, so completely suffocating that you could hear the rain hitting the windows outside. Daniel froze, his eyes darting frantically between Victor and the woman he thought was his ultimate prize. "Divorce papers," Daniel stammered, his voice suddenly weak, completely cracking under the sudden weight of reality. "Sophia, what is he talking about? Who is this man?" Sophia couldn't speak. Her mouth opened and closed, but absolutely no sound came out. She looked exactly like a ghost that had just been dragged forcefully back into the blinding light. People are deeply mistaken about how true power actually works. We are constantly taught to fear the loudest person in the room. We think power is shouting, throwing expensive things, and violently demanding absolute attention. But volume is just a desperate, pathetic mask for weakness. True, terrifying power does not need to raise its voice at all. Power is standing perfectly still while your enemies completely self-destruct right in front of your eyes. Power is knowing the exact piece of hidden information that will instantly dismantle an arrogant empire, and delivering it with a completely quiet, steady voice. I stood there, watching the mighty Reed family begin to crumble into absolute dust, and I didn't need to scream a single word. The silent truth was already doing all the devastating work for me. Victor's words were still hanging in the suffocating air when I finally moved. I walked past Daniel's frozen body and stepped directly in front of the massive entertainment system. I reached into my coat pocket, pulled out a small black drive, and plugged it into the console. Margaret had spent weeks planning a lavish slideshow of her perfect, wealthy life to play for her guests. I decided to give her a completely different kind of presentation. I picked up the remote, took a deep, calming breath, and pressed play. The giant screen illuminated the dark room with a blinding white light, and the absolute truth was finally dragged out of the shadows. The first slide wasn't a happy family photo, it was a highly detailed, heavily encrypted bank statement. I watched Daniel's arrogant eyes snap to the screen, the color completely drained from his face as he stared at the massive numbers. Over the past 6 months, Sophia had systematically funneled over $4 million from his private family trust into a web of untraceable offshore shell companies. $4 million completely gone. Daniel's jaw dropped. He looked at Sophia, his voice shaking with absolute panic. "Sophia, what is this? Oh, tell me this is a lie." But she couldn't say a single word. She just stared at the floor, shivering like a cornered rabbit. I clicked the remote again. A series of private emails flashed across the screen for every single country club guest to read. They were messages Sophia had sent to her secret accomplices. The words were incredibly cruel, completely stripping away any remaining illusion of romance. "The idiot actually gave me the master passwords today," one email read. "His mother is even worse. She is so desperate for a high society daughter-in-law that she practically hands me the checkbook. They are the easiest marks I have ever played." I listened to the wealthy guests, gasping in total shock. I watched Daniel literally stumble backward, his massive ego completely shattering right there on the expensive marble floor. He hadn't replaced me with a better woman. He had replaced me with a parasite that just ate his entire family fortune. But I wasn't finished. I turned to Margaret. She was clutching her chest, gasping for air, desperately trying to hide from the burning stares of her judgmental friends. I clicked the remote one more time. Sophia wasn't the only person hiding devastating secrets in that house. While I was digging through Daniel's home office in the dead of night, I found a deeply hidden folder on Margaret's computer. The screen shifted to display intercepted emails from 3 years ago. They were official job offers. My job offers. 3 separate, highly lucrative positions from top financial firms in the city. Margaret had secretly hacked into my personal email account. She had systematically declined every single offer, intercepted the follow-up calls, and permanently deleted the evidence. For 3 agonizing years, I cried myself to sleep, genuinely believing that I was completely worthless. I thought my career was dead, but it wasn't dead. Margaret had deliberately murdered it. She looked at me, her eyes wide with terrifying guilt. "You needed me to be poor, Margaret," I said, my voice cutting through the silence like a sharp blade. "You needed me to be completely dependent, because the only way you can feel powerful is by standing on the neck of someone you have broken. This is the horrifying truth about control. The most dangerous abuser in your life is not always the one who screams the loudest. It is the one who quietly, systematically manipulates your reality until you genuinely believe you are too weak to survive without them. Wait, they don't just lock the door. They brainwash you into believing you do not even know how to turn the handle." Suddenly, the piercing wail of police sirens shattered the quiet night. Red and blue lights began flashing violently through the massive dining room windows, painting the terrified faces of the Reed family in harsh, unforgiving colors. The guests started panicking, backing away from the table. Sophia made a desperate dash for the kitchen doors, but Victor easily stepped into her path, crossing his arms with a cold smile. "You aren't going anywhere, Lily," he whispered, finally using her real name. The heavy oak doors swung open, and 4 uniformed police officers marched straight into the dining room. They went directly to Sophia, pulling her arms behind her back and snapping the cold metal handcuffs shut. The metallic click echoed beautifully in my ears. I stood there, watching Daniel drop entirely to his knees on the expensive rug, weeping loudly over his vanished millions. I watched Margaret absolutely collapse into a chair, her precious social reputation permanently destroyed in front of everyone. The truth didn't just embarrass them tonight, it completely, irrevocably annihilated them. The flashing lights of the police cruisers finally faded down the long, manicured driveway, leaving the grand dining room in a state of absolute chaotic ruin. The wealthy country club guests were frantically scrambling for the heavy oak doors, desperate to escape the humiliating spectacle before their own reputations were tainted. Margaret was still slumped in her velvet chair, staring blankly at the shattered champagne glass on the marble floor. Her perfect high society empire completely destroyed. And then, cutting right through the heavy, suffocating silence of the room, my cell phone began to ring. It wasn't a friend calling to check on me. It was my lead attorney. I answered it slowly, pressing the speaker button so the sound would echo clearly off the expensive walls. "It is done, Hannah." My lawyer's voice rang out, sharp, cold, and incredibly professional. "The emergency federal injunctions have been fully executed. Every single bank account connected to Daniel Reed, the offshore shell companies, and the main family trust has been officially frozen pending a full fraud investigation." Daniel's head snapped up. His eyes were wide, bloodshot, and filled with a completely new kind of terror. He frantically pulled his own phone from his expensive suit pocket. I watched his trembling thumbs swipe across the glowing screen, desperately trying to log into his banking apps. Access denied, account suspended, contact administrator. He was swiping over and over again, his breathing becoming shallow and incredibly panicked. "They locked everything," he choked out, his voice cracking wildly like a terrified child. "My personal accounts, the business funds, even the credit cards. What did you do to me?" He took a sudden, aggressive step toward me, his fists clenched in pure, desperate rage. But he stopped dead in his tracks, because for the first time in 5 long years, I didn't flinch. I didn't step back. I didn't lower my eyes. I just stood there, completely unmoving, looking at him with absolute freezing indifference. "I didn't do anything to you, Daniel," I replied quietly, my voice completely devoid of any fear. "You and Sophia did this to yourselves. I just made sure I collected the receipts. Every single dime you tried to hide in those illegal offshore accounts is now legally locked down by the federal government. The massive house you are standing in currently has a massive legal lien against it. You thought you could just throw me out into the cold street with a pathetic $5,000 and keep the beautiful life I helped you build. You genuinely thought I was just a stupid, obedient little maid." He looked at me as if I were a complete stranger. The arrogant, powerful city elite was entirely gone, replaced by a pathetic, shivering coward begging for his money. "You are ruining my entire life," he screamed, the veins bulging angrily in his neck. "You are going to completely destroy my family over a stupid, emotional grudge. I am not destroying your family, Daniel. I am auditing it." I corrected him, stepping closer until I was looking right into his terrified, panicked eyes. "For 5 agonizing years, you and your mother systematically drained my self-worth, my career, and my independence. You told me every single day that I had absolutely no value. But while you were busy treating me like invisible dirt in your freezing basement, I learned exactly how much this family is actually worth. And my legal team is going to systematically take back every single penny that belongs to me. People constantly misunderstand the true, ultimate nature of justice. When you are deeply hurt, when you are violently betrayed by the person you trusted most in the world, you think you want them to bleed. You think true satisfaction will come from making them feel the exact same agonizing pain they inflicted on you. But emotional revenge is incredibly cheap. It leaves you bitter, and it doesn't actually rebuild the beautiful life they stole from you. True, ultimate justice is not about hurting the other person. It is about permanently removing their abusive power over you and meticulously taking back every single thing that is rightfully yours. I didn't want Daniel to suffer just for the sake of suffering. I simply wanted my 5 years back. I wanted the successful career they violently sabotaged, the money they ruthlessly stole, and the absolute security they tried to completely destroy. And looking at him right now, crying pathetically over his frozen bank accounts and his ruined, worthless reputation, I realized I didn't even hate him anymore. You cannot hate something you completely pity. I turned around, my cheap shoes clicking softly on his expensive marble floor, and walked straight out of the dining room. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. The execution was completely finished. I stepped out onto the wide stone porch, pulling my cheap coat tightly against the biting wind. Behind me, the heavy oak doors remained wide open, framing the absolute chaos like a tragic, beautiful painting. Two officers were firmly guiding Sophia down the steps, her custom silver gown dragging heavily through the wet mud. She wasn't fighting. She wasn't arguing. The arrogant, untouchable mastermind had completely vanished, replaced by a shivering, terrified criminal facing years in a federal prison. And as they pushed her into the back of the cruiser, the flashing red and blue lights illuminated her pale, defeated face one last time. I didn't feel a single ounce of pity. She had built her entire luxurious life by deliberately destroying people like me. And now, her twisted game was finally over. Through the massive bay windows of the dining room, I could clearly see the aftermath of the explosion. Margaret was still slumped heavily in her velvet chair, completely alone. Her wealthy country club friends, the exact same people she had spent decades trying to impress, had scattered like frightened mice at the very first sign of scandal. The grand, terrifying matriarch of the Reed family, who had spent 5 agonizing years treating me like a worthless peasant. Nia was now nothing more than the pathetic subject of tomorrow's most vicious high society gossip. Her precious, untouchable social empire had completely crumbled into dust in a matter of minutes. And then there was Daniel. He was still kneeling on the expensive imported rug, surrounded by the shattered glass of his ruined celebration. He wasn't crying over his lost bride. He was sobbing over his frozen bank accounts and his completely obliterated ego. For 5 years, he had treated me like an inconvenient piece of furniture because he truly believed his wealth made him a god. But sitting there, completely bankrupt, exposed, and publicly humiliated, he finally understood his own absolute stupidity. He had blindly traded a fiercely loyal wife for a calculated parasite, and it cost him absolutely everything he had. Victor was waiting for me at the bottom of the long driveway, leaning quietly against the sleek door of his car. I walked toward him, and for the first time in 5 long years, my footsteps felt incredibly light. I didn't stop to look over my shoulder. I didn't wait to see Daniel officially lose the house or watch Margaret legally file for bankruptcy. I didn't need to. Society constantly feeds us this incredibly dramatic illusion about revenge. They tell us that to truly win, you have to stand right over the ashes of your enemies and watch them burn to the ground. You have to scream and gloat and demand a painful, tearful apology. But that is completely wrong. True closure doesn't require an audience. Karma is not a theatrical performance. It is a universal law. When it doesn't need you to stand there and personally supervise the punishment, it happens whether you are watching or not. As I slid into the passenger seat and closed the heavy door, I finally let go of the toxic anger that had kept me alive in that freezing basement. They were going to spend the rest of their miserable lives paying for what they did, but I wasn't going to waste a single second of my new life watching them do it. The city lights blurred past the wet car window as we drove away from that massive, suffocating estate for the absolute last time. I leaned my head against the cold glass, listening to the rhythmic hum of the engine. The silence between Victor and me wasn't tense or awkward. It was incredibly peaceful. People always want the classic, predictable fairy tale ending. They desperately want to believe that after the terrifying dragon is finally defeated, the handsome prince scoops up the broken, weeping princess and carries her away into a perfect, wealthy sunset. They want to look at Victor, with his expensive suits and his terrifyingly brilliant legal mind, and cast him as my ultimate savior. But that is not what happened. And that is absolutely not who Victor is. Daniel always needed me to be weak. He built his entire massive ego on the very foundation of my total dependence. He wanted a fragile, terrified bird completely locked inside his expensive golden cage. If I was helpless, he was powerful. But Victor never once looked at me and saw a pathetic victim. When I sat across from him in that freezing, dimly lit diner 3 weeks ago, my hands shaking and my spirit entirely broken. When he didn't offer me a warm blanket, he didn't pull me into his arms and tell me everything was going to be magically okay. He slid a heavy folder of damning evidence across the sticky table and told me to walk directly back into the fire. He didn't ride in on a white horse to rescue me. He handed me a sharp sword and firmly told me to fight my own way out. If he had just swooped in with his massive team of high-priced corporate lawyers and destroyed the Reed family entirely on his own, I would have just been trading one powerful master for another. I would have stepped out of Daniel's dark shadow, only to stand quietly in Victor's. I would have remained the exact same pathetic, helpless little wife who desperately needed a wealthy, capable man to fix her completely shattered life. Victor understood that deeply. He knew that the trauma of the last 5 years wasn't just about stolen money. It was about my stolen identity. He knew that the only way I could ever truly heal, the only way I could ever completely take my absolute power back, was if I was the one holding the match when their cruel empire finally burned to the ground. He didn't save me. He deliberately, relentlessly forced me to save myself. As he parked the car in front of my small, quiet apartment building, he finally turned the engine off and looked at me. There was no grand, dramatic, romantic declaration. There were no desperate promises of forever. There was just a quiet, profound respect shining in his dark eyes, the kind of respect you only give to an absolute equal. We are partners now, not because I desperately need his money, his influence, or his protection to simply survive in this world, but because we fought side by side in the absolute trenches. We built our new foundation on total truth and mutual power, not on manipulation, isolation, and quiet abuse. Society teaches women to constantly look for a knight in shining armor to rescue them from the dark. But true love is not about finding someone to magically save you from your terrifying nightmares. It is about finding someone who stands firmly beside you, completely trusting you while you bravely conquer those monsters yourself. Love, true, undeniable love, is when you finally realize you no longer need to be saved. It has been exactly 1 year since I walked out of that massive, suffocating house for the absolute last time. The timeline of healing is a strange, delicate thing. At first, you still wake up in the middle of the night with your heart racing, expecting to hear heavy footsteps coming down the hall, but eventually, the silence stops feeling like a terrifying threat and starts feeling like absolute, beautiful peace. I didn't just survive their storm. I used the rain to grow a completely new life. I moved into a bright, beautiful apartment with massive windows that let in the warm morning sun. There are no dark basements here. There's no one tracking my every single purchase, and absolutely no one criticizing the cheap coffee I drink. I went back to the financial district. I walked right into the very same corporate firm that Margaret had tried to permanently block me from, and I demanded an interview. I didn't hide my empty 5-year resume gap. Or I looked those wealthy executives dead in the eye and told them exactly how I meticulously tracked $4 million in encrypted offshore shell accounts, using nothing but a cheap flashlight and a stolen laptop. They offered me a senior position on the exact same day. With my very first massive bonus, I didn't buy designer clothes or expensive jewelry to show off to people who do not matter. I bought my parents a beautiful, quiet little house just outside the city. They finally left that exhausted Midwest farm behind. Seeing my mother planting bright yellow roses in her own front yard, seeing my father finally resting comfortably on the porch, that was my ultimate revenge. True power isn't just about completely destroying the people who hurt you. It is about absolutely protecting the people who actually love you. Daniel and Margaret are completely gone from my mind now. I heard through the inevitable city gossip that they legally lost the grand estate. They lost their exclusive country club memberships, their fake wealthy friends, and every single drop of their precious, arrogant pride. But the strangest part is, I don't even care. People always think that the story officially ends the moment the villain is finally defeated. They think your new life begins the day you win the massive lawsuit and watch your abusers cry on the floor. But that is a complete lie. Your real life does not begin when you finally win the brutal war. It begins the exact moment you no longer feel the desperate need to look back at the battlefield. You stop waiting for their pathetic, tearful apologies. You stop needing them to admit they were entirely wrong. You simply stop needing their recognition at all. You become completely, beautifully untouchable. If you are sitting there right now, staring at a cold wall, feeling like your spirit is completely broken, if someone has spent years deliberately convincing you that you have absolutely no value, please listen to my voice. You are not broken, and you are absolutely not worthless. You are just standing in the exact wrong place, desperately holding on to the absolute wrong people. You are a seed that was buried in toxic, poisoned soil. All you have to do is bravely pull up your roots, walk out that heavy door, and completely rebuild your own beautiful empire.